Thank you for the introduction. Yes, my name is Giorgio Morales, and I will be talking about this symbolic regression paper. So, to give you a little bit of context, there's no doubt that after the boom of deep learning, we were able to create outstanding models that were capable of outperforming classic machine learning techniques and even human performance in many application areas. But now we have models that are too complicated to understand or to interpret, and now these black box models are not very suitable for applications in which the exact objective is to understand the underlying processes that are behind the data that we're collecting. And that's a problem because one of the goals of science is to discover causal explanations in the form of mathematical laws and equations to explain the observable world. That's where the field of symbolic regression gains a lot of importance because it aims to do exactly that. We receive data sets of observations that we can process in using symbolic regression, and the goal is going to obtain a mathematical expression that can be a full functional expression like that one, or a symbolic skeleton like in that case, that is explaining the behavior or the functional form of the data that we collected. So we're going to tackle the multivariate symbolic regression problem. In this case, we are going to consider that we have a system that is a function of t variables. F represents the underlying function of the system, and we can assume that this function can be expressed as a mathematical expression that uses unary operators and binary operators as well. The goal for this type of problems is that when we're given a data set of observations, we want to generate a mathematical expression f tilde that approximates the behavior of the underlying function. So before moving on, I want to explain what is a symbolic skeleton expression. So in this example, consider that if we're given this function, the next one will be the corresponding, is this working? Yeah. The next one will be the corresponding skeleton. And basically what we're doing is to replace all the coefficient values with constant placeholders. And now this skeleton is just explaining the functional form of the original function. So there are many problems associated with current symbolic regression methods. One of them is that the primary focus lies on the minimization of the prediction error that is caused by the generated expressions, instead of focusing on the identification of the functional form that is most suitable for your data. Also, there are many methods that rely mainly on genetic programming, and as a consequence they suffer from slow computation because the search space is huge. And also this type of methods don't consider past experiences, and as a consequence they are not able to scale or when you have more data or better data. There are many methods that don't necessarily suffer from these limitations, but in multivariate systems, they often fail to identify the correct functional form that explains the relationship between each input variable and the system's response, which is the system's output. So let's talk about contributions, and the main one is a method that learns univariate skeleton explanations, that explain the functional form between an independent variable and the system's response. And we're going to tackle the problem of multivariate symbolic regression as a sequence of a new type of problem that we're calling multi-set symbolic skeleton prediction, MSSP. And to solve this problem, we are presenting a novel transformer network called multi-set transformer, whose objective is to generate univariate skeletons that explain the functional relationships between individual inputs and the system's output. So, to justify the need of this new type of problem, multi-set symbolic skeleton prediction, let me introduce or explain this example in which we have a function that is dependent on two variables, x1 and x2. And just for the purpose of this example, consider that we have collected a data set that is huge. So let's consider that we want to understand what's the relationship between variable x1 and the output of the system. If that's the case, that means that we have to fix the value of variable x2, and we can just fix it to a random value. Let's suppose that we fix it to the value 5. So I can grab from this data set just the samples in which the variable x2 is equal to 5. That means that I can create a subset, and I can plot that subset as you can see here. So if I use this subset and I use it as an input to a symbolic skeleton prediction method like Nesimbres, which is a work that was proposed by Luca Biggio in 2021, I can obtain the corresponding skeleton. So basically, what this method is telling me is that the behavior of this input set is quadratic, which looks pretty much quadratic, but actually that was not the functional skeleton I was expecting to obtain. So the question is, what would have happened if I had selected another value for variable x2? What if instead of 5, I had selected the value 0.1? Then in that case, I would have obtained this kind of subset and that kind of behavior. If I repeat the same operation, now I obtain this skeleton, which in this case is correct. The problem is that during inference, I don't know which skeleton is correct because I don't know what is the underlying function of the system. That's what I'm trying to get. So our observation is that this symbolic skeleton problem will benefit from additional context, from additional information, because when we're analyzing one specific variable and we fix the value of the remaining variables, we can project a function into a space in which it's difficult to identify the correct functional form. So we are proposing to process the information from multiple sets simultaneously to produce a symbolic skeleton that is common to all input sets. And we are going to refer to this problem as multi-set symbolic skeleton prediction. So again, from the same problem, instead of fixing the value of x2 to a single value and hope for the best, we're going to fix it to multiple values and we're going to create multiple sets. And even though they may correspond to different behaviors, we know that all of them correspond to the same functional form. So we are going to use them as inputs to an MSSP solver, and the estimated skeleton is going to represent the functional form that is common to all input sets. So to solve this problem, we can't use a standard transformer because they were designed to process sequences with fixed orderings, and that is not the case for sets. In the case of sets, if you permute their elements, the semantics are going to remain being the same. Now, there's a model that is called set transformer, but that was designed to process one set at a time, but in this case, we're using multiple sets at a time. So we're proposing a multi-set transformer architecture to solve this problem, and the objective is to pre-train this model on a large data set of synthetic expressions so that it's ready to perform inference for whenever we receive a new data that correspond to the phenomena that we're studying or that we're observing. So this is a simplified view of the multi-set transformer architecture that we're proposing. You can see that all input sets are being processed within the encoder, and specifically each input set is being processed using an encoder stack, which is an induced set attention block that was proposed in the original set transformer paper. So basically for each input set we are obtaining a latent representation, and then we can aggregate all of these latent representations using an attention mechanism to obtain a single representation that is going to be processed using a decoder stack, which is the same used by the typical transformer. So we're going to generate the output tokens in an iterative way until we generate the end of sentence character. And in the end, we obtain an estimated skeletons that represents a mathematical expression in prefix notation. So, for example, if we have this expression right here, we can express it as a sequence of operators in prefix notation, and we can translate this sequence into a sequence of integers using a vocabulary that we predefine. So, as I mentioned, we are going to train our multi-set transformer using a large data set of synthetic skeletons. So we generate symbolic skeletons like this one. And by the way, you can find our generation method in the appendix of our paper. It basically differs from what has been done by previous methods significantly, and we found out that other methods had an important bias toward the generations of very simple expressions, so that an expression like this had a very low probability of appearing. So once that we generated all the skeletons, we can start generating different sets of inputs and outputs by generating or by sampling different coefficient values, like we see in this example. All of these correspond to different behaviors, but actually correspond to the same functional form because we're using different coefficient values here. And these are the kind of data that are being used to train the multi-set transformer. So everything that I talked so far was to train the multi-set transformer model on the data set of synthetic expressions. Now we're in a different context. We are going to suppose that we are studying a specific phenomenon, we're collecting data, and we have questions. We want to understand how each variable, or what is the functional relationship that explains the connection between each input variable and the output of the system. So we're going to collect data, we're going to train a neural network, and then we want to extract explanations from it using the multi-set transformer model that we have already pre-trained. So the first step is going to approximate the behavior of the underlying function of the system, and we're going to use a neural network denoted F tilde. Basically, we're going to train it in the old-fashioned way, just by minimizing the minimum square error. So now suppose that we want to analyze one specific variable of the system, xv. In this example, xv is equal to x1. We want to synthesize multiple sets by fixing the values of the remaining variables, in this case x2 and x3. So here x1 is allowed to vary, while the other variables are fixed to random values that are going to be different each time. So in that way, we're generating multiple synthetic sets. And the estimated response of that set is going to be calculated using the neural network that we trained before. So now we have a collection of sets. We have the input and the estimated response. And the definition or the form of this collection is the same as the input of our multi-set transformer. So we are going to use all of these sets. We're going to feed them into the pre-trained multi-set transformer, and what we're going to obtain is an estimated skeleton that is attempting to describe the functional form that is common to all of these input sets. And basically is the functional relationship between variable x1 and the output y. And we'll repeat that for each variable of the system. So I also want to talk about the skeleton performance evaluation that we're carrying out in this work. It differs significantly from what has been done in previous works because we are not at the point where we have the final estimated multivariate function that combines all variables in just one single equation. We are at the point in which we generate one estimated skeleton for each variable of the system. So let's use this example to illustrate that. Let's suppose that we have a multivariate function and we are extracting only the skeleton that corresponds to variable x1, and we have it here. And we do the same for the functions that are generated by other methods. So now the question is, if this first estimated skeleton is equivalent to the ground truth skeleton. And it turns out that if two skeletons are mathematically equivalent, it really doesn't matter if they're using different operators. If they are truly equivalent, then they should be so for any combination of values that I decide to use here. So if I sample the coefficients for this skeleton using random values for these coefficients, then I can generate multiple values for x1 and I can calculate the corresponding output. And now using that data, I can fit the coefficients for this skeleton. Again, if they are equivalent, I should be able to find a combination of these values that is going to minimize the distance between the two functions. And I would obtain an expression like this that is equivalent to this one here. Basically, I'm minimizing the distance between them. And I can do something similar even if I sample a new function that corresponds to the same family of function that corresponds actually to the same skeleton. I can find this other expression that, again, is minimizing the distance. So that means that the two skeletons are equivalent. But it's going to be different for the other case, for this case, because we already know that these two skeletons are not equivalent by knowing math. But we can use the same approach as before, using these sample functions. And the best that I can do will be something like this. This is the function that minimizes the distance, and it's going to happen something similar to it for the other example. So what is happening is that because this function does not represent the same functional form as this, we can't find a function that matches perfectly. So what I'm going to do is to use this error, as a similarity metric. So I'm going to sample different functions and then I'm going to report what are these areas or these errors. The lower, the better, of course. So for experimental results, what we did was to generate 1 million of expressions to train our multi-set transformer model, and 10 to the 5 expressions for validation, allowing up to 1 nested operation in our generated skeletons. And here we have a few model parameters. Of course, you can find all of the details in our paper, and also the data set that we generated is available at Hugging Face. And for our experiments, we used synthetic problems that were generated from known underlying equations. Many of these equations have been proposed in other papers, and some of these were proposed in this work. The idea is to have a set of challenging equations that have different kinds of operators. And also I extended the range of many of the equations that were proposed in previous works, just to make the problem a little bit harder. So this is an example of the kind of results that we obtained, specifically for problem E2. And this is the underlying function for problem E2. This could be the target that corresponds to, the target skeleton that corresponds to x1, to x2, and to x3. What we want to do is to compare the skeletons that we obtain using our multi-set transformer, like these ones, to the skeletons that are obtained using other symbolic regression methods. As you can see, in these 3 cases, we are obtaining skeletons that are equivalent to the ground truth. You can say that this skeleton, for example, that is produced by method E2E is equivalent to the ground truth, because you can always set C2 equal to 0. But what we found is that E2E tends to generate skeletons that are unnecessarily longer. But for example, for x2, there's no way that this skeleton and this skeleton belong to the same family of functions. So we also calculated the performance metrics that I mentioned before for all of the data sets and for all of the methods. And we, after 30 iterations, and basically here we are reporting the mean value and the corresponding standard deviation. Everything that is highlighted in bold means that the method achieved significantly better performance with respect to the other methods. So you can see that in all of the cases, our multi-set transformer obtained the best result or one of the best results. And also E2E does a good job, but the main difference is that it doesn't find the correct skeleton consistently for all of the variables of the problems. And that happens mainly because other methods focus on the variables that are more relevant for the minimization of the prediction error. Whereas in our case, we obtain the correct skeletons for all of the cases, and that's because we are focusing on each variable independently on what's happening to the other variables. Also, that means that we're not giving more importance to one variable than the others. And this is just a subset of the problems. This behavior is consistent for the rest of the problems. You can see all of the results in the paper. Oh no, they're actually here. But it's basically the same. So, to conclude, what we're doing is aiming to establish the basis for a decomposable symbolic regression method. What we're planning to do is to grab all of these skeletons, univariate skeletons, and then merge them into a final multivariate expression. But what we're doing right now is proposing the first neural symbolic regression method that prioritizes the identification of the functional relationships between each input variable and the output of the system. Actually, our method allows for a better understanding of how each input variable contributes to the behavior of, to the overall behavior of the system. And our experimental results are demonstrating that our multi-set transformer model learns to identify skeletons correctly and consistently for all system variables. And finally, our method can be viewed as a post-hoc interpretability method that generates mathematical expressions as interpretations of a black box model's function, in this case a neural network. So, thank you. Let me know if you have any questions.
Okay, thank you. We have time for 1 or 2 quick questions. Yeah. Thank you very much. Super interesting. I have two questions. So first of all, could you comment on the basically maximum complexity entailed in your synthetic training data in terms of like skeleton complexity? And secondly, for the evaluation of testing your method, did you use only formulas that could be generated or contained or based on skeletons that are contained in your training data, or are you also testing on much more complex functions, for example?
Okay, yeah, good questions, thanks. Let me think of the first one. I don't remember exactly the parameters because we are essentially generating trees. To generate a mathematical expression, we're generating trees, and of course we have a limit on the depth. And after the tree is generated, we'll still simplify them if there's possibility of simplifying them. In that sense, I did have a maximum, but I don't remember. I can say that the maximum number of univariate operators that I consider was 5. And again, I was considered a maximum of 1 nested operation, meaning that we can have something like sine of x squared, but not sine of exponential of x squared. And that's basically because I was trying to generate expressions that were consistent to the ones that were used to train previous methods. It would be a little bit unfair to have a more complete data set and say, okay, I'm doing better than the other methods. So in terms of comparison, that's the reason why we're doing that. But another comment is that is just to demonstrate comparisons, but at the same time, it serves as an initial model that can be scaled if you have more specific needs, I guess, or more specific type of expressions. And regarding your second question, I forgot it.
Yeah, basically, if you did the validation or the evaluation of your method on formulas that are also in this complexity range, or on maybe even more complex formulas?
Yeah, no, it's they're not necessarily the same. They don't appear. I mean, I make sure that they don't appear in the training set. These were actually coming from other papers, and again, questions that I consider that were challenging, and again, were not appearing in the training set, but within the range. It would be interesting to obtain something that was not within the initial parameters, but I don't think that we can hope for that.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, any more questions? Got time for one more quick one. That's all. Over there.
Sorry, quick question. So is there a possibility for the transformer not to output something that parses?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Is it possible for the transformer that generates the expression to generate something that it cannot be parsed by a calculator, essentially? For example, can it output a plus and then one sum, but not a second one?
I haven't seen that behavior. I mean,
But in theory, it could happen. Right?
Yes, it could have. I guess the reason is why it's not happening is that we are given a little bit more than 1 million of expressions, and it learns the correct structure of all these mathematical expressions without the need of an explicit way to control or to avoid that kind of behavior. So since there was no need, we didn't take that as a part of the task that we had to do.
Thanks. That concludes this session.